Let me start out by saying that the basic model, let me see if I can get this thing so it doesn't do that to us. The basic model that I'm going to be presenting is organized around the notion that we are a tribal species. You know, from the work of John Bowlby, Margaret Mahler, Mary Ainsworth, D.W. Winnicott, Dan Stern, Heinz Kohut, Dan Siegel, Alan Shore, Stephen Porges, Dan Hughes, Lou Cozolino, and many, many more. I think we have grown to have an increasing awareness of the fact that in many respects, we are as well as we are well connected. In short, the message of today can be kind of captured in this sentence. Troubled kids do best when served in treatment milieus where their clinical caretakers support them in feeling safe, understood, and lovable. Now, the word love we don't bring into the clinical setting all that often, and I'll be careful in my use of it today, but I think that's fundamentally what we're talking about. Kids who have a sense that they elicit from others a longing to care for them associated with core capacity to be lovable. So let's start with defining a clinical milieu. So a clinical milieu is a clinical environment designed and implemented to promote healing. That's a pretty simple concept. Probably could apply across settings. It could apply across psychiatric settings, day treatment programs, residential programs, public school programs, maybe even any environment, including a medical facility, a medical unit. So what are the components of a milieu? Because this will help us kind of organize what we're thinking about today. I think of the milieu as really being organized around three primary domains. First, you have the physical domain. That's the building, the setting. Where you're attempting to do this work, is it clean? Is it organized well so that there's space for use as private discussion? There's place for sanctuary for kids when they need it. There's open area for play. There's the physical plan, and that's an important part of any treatment milieu. Having worked in this field for a long time, I've worked in a lot of different settings, many of which were less than optimal. Second is the structural domain. And by structural domain, we're really talking about how is the milieu organized to support the child's experience of it as coherent. So when we think about structural domain, we think about issues such as time. Are things scheduled? Do things happen when you say they're going to happen? We think of things such as the use of space. Are there various spaces that have different uses? Are there rules that are associated with one room versus another room? All of these are things that help kids begin to make sense out of the world, because many of the kids that we're going to be talking about today have some real fundamental limitations in their capacity to figure out how the world operates. They experience the world as largely governed by randomness. So the importance of structure to help them begin to experience the world as a place where things are predictable cannot be overstated, the importance of that. But it also entails things such as behavioral expectations and consequences. When we talk about behavioral programs, we're really talking about a form of structure that falls within the structural domain. And any program that's serving troubled kids needs to have a very predictable, coherent behavioral program that could take many different forms. All three of these are terribly important to our effective work with the population of kids who I'm going to describe to you in a few minutes who are served in these intensive settings. But the third one here, the relational domain, is what we're going to be talking about most today. In no way does a focus on the relational domain diminish the critical importance of the physical or structural domain. Those are critical. But the relational domain is kind of the last step, but it's a critical step in our capacity to be a healing force in the lives of the majority of the kids who come into intensive milieu-based treatment programs. So let's take a minute and think about who are these kids served within these intensive treatment programs. I'm going to identify three broad groups. Now, certainly there are some youngsters who might be served in these programs who wouldn't fit in these categories, but I think this is a good starting point. It captures most of the kids. We've got kids with developmental trauma and PTSD. Say the largest group of kids who are served in intensive treatment settings probably fall into this category. These are kids whose lives have been kind of chronically overwhelming. Kids who have not had enough experience with the adult world as understanding their needs and being able to meet them. They've not had enough experience with coherent structure, predictability. These are kids who've spent a lot of time essentially feeling overwhelmed. And then you've got the kids with more discrete PTSD. That's a smaller group served within these settings, but those kids do come in, and these kids can be thought of as essentially having had their brains rewired by this trauma in such a way that they're not able to make good sense of their internal world, the external world, and they're oftentimes limited in their ability to utilize relationships to soothe that issue. The second group, we've got kids who come into these settings with affective disorders. Lots and lots of kids present within the intensive milieu setting with depressive disorders, sometimes complex mood disorders. Third, we've got kids with high-functioning autism. Now, I'm not here to talk today about kids with more severe developmental disabilities. I really think that those kids are best served within programs that have very focused ABA models. I think the DD unit at Spring Harbor, that's a different set of kids with slightly different set of needs, or maybe a significantly different set of needs. It doesn't mean that some of the attachment-informed thought or stance can't be used with that population, but that population is distinct, and I'm really not here to talk about them today. However, the high-functioning ASD kids I am here to talk about because many of their needs are very similar to the first two in this heading. Then the reality is that many of the kids we work with come in with some combination of the above. I think at the collaborative school, the day treatment program that I've had long-term affiliation with, I think one of the largest groups of kids that we saw were kids in the spectrum who had histories of trauma, developmental trauma. These kids who had limited kind of adaptive skills organically and then were consistently in situations that were overwhelming for them. So the next question is, what are the needs of these kids? If these are the kids who we're working with, how do we kind of understand the needs that they come into this setting with and that we are in some way obligated to try to address? I think of three broad categories of developmental struggles for this population. First is the limited capacity to form and utilize trusting relationships. For the kids with developmental trauma, the metaphor that I like best is the idea that these kids have been riding in a vehicle with caretakers who don't know how to drive. And they keep driving the vehicle off the road into a tree. And the child very quickly begins to understand, this person doesn't know how to keep me safe. So what do? They begin to try to grab the wheel. Anybody who's worked extensively with kids with real attachment issues, with developmental trauma, with reactive attachment, understands what it is to have a child try to take control of your caretaking. So these kids, now they start grabbing the wheel. Now, does that help them not go off the road? No. But now, as they go off the road into the tree, the attribution is oftentimes to the child, no longer to the driver. Well, what happens when these kids get put in a new vehicle with a new driver, somebody who knows how to drive? What do? They grab the wheel. And they take the car off the road into the tree. These kids block our care. And that's a very complex phenomenon to manage. They don't trust in their caretakers, so they can't hand their lives over to them in the way in which they need to be able to allow us to provide them a distinct experience of the adult world, of the caretaker world. So these kids have difficulty forming and using trusting relationships. Because what we're supposed to use trusting relationships with is to make us feel safe. And a little later, we'll talk about the whole notion of co-regulation of emotion. They're supposed to help us feel safe. And we're supposed to be able to move close to that caretaker when we're struggling, when we're anxious. And that caretaker is there to help us co-regulate our emotion, which later facilitates our learning how to self-regulate emotion. So these kids end up not getting the care they need and then ultimately blocking the care they need. And then Hughes talks about they then set the stage for what he and Balin refer to as block care. After a while, caretakers get so frustrated that they begin to not offer the care because they believe it's not going to provide much in the way of relief. So they have limited capacity to regulate emotion. As I was just saying, we understand in attachment, we have a pretty clear sense that the way children learn how to regulate emotion is through co-regulation, through the caretaker who knows how to find the child where they are emotionally, meet them. Dan Stern talked about the term of having equal vitality with the child's affect. I think one of the nicest examples of this is what do we do with an infant? When an infant is crying, we go up and what do? We go, oh, buddy, what's going on? We match their affect. We pick them up, and then we try to figure out what it is that they need from us. We rock them. We do whatever it is that we think will relieve them. But it always starts with the matching of affect and then the co-regulation of the affect back down to a settled state. So kids who can't let adults close enough to support them in that are going to have real problems in the process of self-regulation because they haven't had enough co-regulatory experiences. And then lastly, we've got what is sometimes referred to, Casalino, I think, talks about this really eloquently, core shame. These kids, because of the egocentricity of childhood, because of the need to protect the idealized sense of the caretaker, because it produces less anxiety to think there's something wrong with you than to think there's something wrong with the caretaker who is really responsible and capable of keeping you safe. So these kids develop a sense of themselves as fundamentally not being lovable. These kids have both an emotion and oftentimes a narrative that organizes around the notion that I am unlovable. These are big limitations. These are not easy kids to help. But which of the million domains seems to relate most directly to the healing of the issues we just talked about? Let me warn you, this is a trick question. It's all three of them. If the child isn't fundamentally safe, if he can't make sense out of an environment, if his environment is chaotic, incoherent, you're not going to be able to do any of the other work. They have to feel safe first. However, once we've established that, once we have a degree of coherency, then when we look at the capacity to form and utilize relationships, co-regulation, and core shame, we really then need to look very carefully at this whole notion of relational stance. What is the relational stance that the caretaker has in their interactions with the child. These are some common relational stances, and I see them in families, I see them in schools, I see them in treatment settings. And I think you'll pretty quickly see I have a bias for the bottom one, but we have authoritarian stance, where the primary focus of the caretaker is on the maintenance of the hierarchy, a belief that it is only safe when there is recognition and embracing of the hierarchy. The adult is here, the child is here, and if there's anything that challenges that in any way, that becomes a very central focus. An instructional focus on teaching skills. It's where the idea is that what these kids need are kind of cognitive models in which to have greater adaptive capacities. And that's good. I believe in cognitive models. I believe that cognitive behavioral work, DBT, those things can all be helpful. I also believe that if you have a youngster who's fundamentally anxious at the level that we're talking about with many of these kids, they're not going to be able to access that cognitive model when they need it the most. We've got kids who, or caretakers who approach relationships kind of from an effort to be amicable, kind of friendships. That sense that the focus on the shared bond. We've got a relational stance that's kind of characterized by being neutral, kind of a scorekeeper. The focus on upholding the structure and rules. These are all pretty common relational stances in work with kids. And we all probably fluctuate some between them, depending on the situation, depending on how much sleep we had the night before, depending on how exhausted we are by a child's just insistence on taking the wheel from us. But the last one here, the attachment-informed relational stance, is what we're talking about within the attachment model as truly being healing. So the attachment-informed focuses on supporting a sense of safety, feeling known and felt, connected, and helped in the development of competencies. That's a tall order. That's a tall order in dealing with your own children. That's a particularly tall order in working with somebody else's. Working in groups where there are 80 of these little guys who need that from us. This is not easy work. To bring a relational stance into a milieu where you have youngsters who are challenging virtually every boundary is not easy. However, it is my belief that it's absolutely essential. The next question is, can clinical caretakers be taught the attachment-informed relational stance? Is this something we can teach people? Boy, some of that just sounds like it's just an aspect of who you are, how you think about the world, how you think about relationships. Well, my answer to that is usually. We can usually teach people to get better at it. Some people are going to just naturally be better at it. And we're going to talk about how we determine who is best suited for this work, and then what we do to facilitate their ability to do it as well as we want them to be able to do it. So yes, most can, but they have to be taught the model, and the model has to be reinforced. We'll talk about how we assure success in staff, in their learning how to do this work. So what are the core skills, insights associated with the attachment stance? And today, guys, there are probably about 12 that I talk about in the book. I would lose you if I tried to go over 12 of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the most essential variables. And we'll just touch real quickly on the skills and insights, a larger list of them. But we're going to go into some detail with respect to these first two. So core skills and insights to be taught to support staff in presenting an attachment-informed relational stance. The first thing is to help staff seek and value experiences of intersubjectivity. Okay? So what does that mean? Intersubjectivity is the catalyst of connection.
You just get on Jabber.
Transient, non-hierarchy,
You log into 9801.
shared affect, attention, and
How do you
intent.
log into 9801?
Sometimes
You just type it up here.
describes
This address bar is to give you for
feeling
9600.
Dude, that's awesome.
To operationalize that, I'm going to move to the next section and give you some examples of what intersubjectivity looks like and how it is that we can pursue it in our interactions with kids. This comes directly from Hughes. The acronym PACE. If there's one thing that I want clinical caretakers to take from their supervision with me, is the understanding of the importance of intersubjectivity, those moments where there is no hierarchy, where you just come together and you have a shared sense of affect, a shared sense of intent, and a shared focus. Those moments are the catalyst to the creation of attachment and connection. And I want them to then know that if they keep PACE in their pocket, they will more often than not have a means by which to pursue intersubjectivity. So PACE, let's go over it really quickly. The first, the P is playful. People, parents, many of us in treatment settings, we think about playfulness as kind of like the icing on the cake. Playfulness is, that's a nice thing when we can have it. Playfulness, from my perspective, is one of the most important and most accessible means by which to reach moments of intersubjectivity. When the little one has a stuffed bunny and mom and dad have a shared delusion with that little one that stuffed bunny is real, and bunny falls out of the bed and dad scoops him up and says, "Oh dear, bunny's hurt his ear, we need to take him to the bunny doctor." That kind of playfulness meets the criteria of intersubjectivity. When you've got a little boy and his daughter or son, and they're out in the field, and they each have a stick, and they're playing Star Wars, and dad is Darth Vader, and the little boy is Luke Skywalker trying to vanquish evil, and they are lost in that moment of play with no intent other than connection. No intent other than sharing that moment. Playfulness is phenomenally powerful. I use it in my private practice a lot. I have a just despicable-looking wolf puppet who lives behind my sofa. And invariably, at some point with kids, and sometimes in every session with some kids, Wolfie comes out, and he's got two sharp fangs. And Wolfie's deal is that Wolfie's a good wolf who does bad things. And invariably, at some point, Wolfie turns on me in the session. Wolfie will turn to the kids and say, "Does Dr. Stewart ever shut up?" He will do something that in some way says, this experience is not so powerful. It's not so important. There are few ways to make kids less accessible than making them worried. The population of kids we're talking about right now spend a lot of the time looking into the eyes of caretakers who are going, "Oh my God, what do I do? What's wrong with you?" Playfulness is the antithesis of that. Playfulness is a way of saying, we can put that all aside, and let's just be here together. Playfulness is a hugely important tool in creating the kind of intersubjectivity that is at the root of what it is to help these kids heal. Second is accepting. And this is the idea that we accept absolutely every thought, feeling, or perception that a child presents. The child comes in and says, "You hated me, and you've hated me since the day I walked onto the unit." We accept it. If he says, "I hate Muslims," we accept it. If he says, you know, I'm going to kill myself by tomorrow and you'll be happy when I do, we accept it. We start at a point of profound acceptance. We do not accept all behavior by any stretch of the imagination, but we accept all thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. Because when we do that, we are then allowed to be a part of it. When the child says, you've hated me since the moment you met me, and I know it, so I can go, oh man, that must be hard. So you're forced here to sit with me, and you're pretty certain that I hate you. The reflection back to a child of acceptance cannot be done with just words. It has to have the quality of what's sometimes referred to as an affective reflective interaction. So when the child gives you a statement that has affect connected to it, you have to give it back to him, perhaps with a clarified narrative for him that has affect connected. That's the way that information goes in and gets processed. Because part of what we're trying to do is help these kids create more coherent narratives about themselves. So I say back to whatever they say, oh, you hate Muslim people, huh, buddy? Oh, and there are a lot of them in your school now. That must be hard. Now, most of us, what do we want to do when kids say stuff like that? We want to correct their thoughts. And what do they do when we try to do that? They shut down. But the magic is that if we really do acceptance well, we can then move into C. We can be curious. We can say, buddy, after we've accepted it, we say, what makes you think I hate you? What makes you... I had a little girl in my office not 2 days ago who said she wanted her dad to die. I said, what makes you want your dad to die? And she began to talk to me about why she wanted her dad to die. And then she began to identify reasons she didn't want her dad to die. Because, sometimes he plays basketball with her. She had a longer list of why she wanted him to die. But she began to develop a list that had some exceptions in it. And she began to put words to this feeling, this kind of right hemispheric, just disorganized feeling. And then when I'm curious, I'm drawing words from her, which is an integrative experience and supports her in developing a way of understanding herself. You cannot be curious with a kid unless you have first been accepting. If you're curious with kids and you have not expressed real acceptance, they experience your curiosity as gathering information to prosecute a position. Teenagers, one of the first things I tell parents who are struggling with their kids is stop asking them questions. Kids believe that the questions are almost always done with the intent of gaining information to prosecute them some way, particularly these kids. But if you're accepting, you can then move into a curious position. And last is empathy. And there are two forms of empathy. One is just the child feeling felt. The child being able to see that we get what it's like to be them. We understand the feelings that they have. We're feeling them with them. The other kind of empathy is associated with your knowing the child better than they know themselves, in a way that supports you in figuring out what positions you can put them in, what you can't. Kids don't know their own limitations. They don't know what they need. They know what they want, but they don't know what they need. And our empathy, our understanding of the child from the inside out, has to inform how we respond to their wants and needs. One of my favorite sayings, I don't know where I heard this, I think I stole it from someone, is that kids desperately need adults to know the difference between their wants and their needs. But one of the needs of all kids is to sometimes have their wants met. So empathy informs the situations in which we put youngsters. In the book, I talk a fair amount about Heinz Kohut's concept of optimal frustration and how learning how to challenge a child within a range that affords him the opportunity to gain mastery is really what good caretaking is all about. You have to know the child well to do that. Because if we consistently under-challenge the child, it enfeebles them. But if we consistently over-challenge the child, it enfeebles them. So that our empathy is what informs our ability to know at what level to challenge a child. So I'm going to talk about a few other, real quickly, I'm going to go over these. One of the things that is just terribly important in the attachment-informed relational stance is understanding of the power of nonverbals. You know, our nonverbals are the language of the heart. And if you are not interacting with a child that reflects and provides them some sense of you being, essentially giving them the nonverbal cues to say you're there with them, not in an intellectual way, but in an emotional way. Paying attention to kids' nonverbals and using your own. Padded boundaries. This is a concept that I like. The idea that when you're setting limits for kids, particularly these kids who have limited ability to tolerate frustration, the boundaries need to be firm or the world doesn't make sense to them. We don't give them the structure they need. The boundaries have to be firm. But there's a big difference between slamming into a cement wall that stops us and slamming into a wall that's padded with pillows. And our job, when we set limits, is to provide those limits in as padded a way as possible. So when the youngsters can't go to gym because he didn't clean his room, we say, oh, buddy, I'm sorry, you know the rule. You can't go to gym right now because your room didn't get cleaned up in time. So our nonverbals and what we say help in the expression of that. They're essential in the expression of the padding. I might even say, you know, if you get to work on it right now, or maybe I can help you, and you can go down to the second half of gym. When kids experience limits as being provided in a way where they're not movable, but at the same time, they're offered with kindness and with gentleness. Matter of fact, with many of these kids, you've got to set the limit, and you know what you have to do right after you set the limit? You have to run around to the other side and help them not unravel. You have to be emotionally available. One of the toughest times for these kids are when they're confronting a limit. There's no time when they need us emotionally present more when these kids than when they are confronting a limit. So padded boundaries is a concept I talk a lot with frontline staff on, just saying, look, find a way to say this gently. Find a way that empathizes with what it's like for the child. But do not move away from the boundary. The boundary is part of their feeling safe. Emotional co-regulation, we've talked about that. Connect, tear, repair. The notion that the way in which relationships form and strengthen is much like muscle fiber. We connect, something comes along and we tear, and then we make the repair. And that relationships, whether it's with your girlfriend, your partner, your child, relationships are strengthened by that process. So that in effort to make certain that this always happens, that the repair is always pursued, a rule that is pretty clear in my mind is that the repair is always the adult's responsibility. It is always the caretaker's responsibility. Now, if a child beats you to it, it doesn't mean say, no, you can't say you're sorry because I have to do it first. And sometimes you can't make that repair until you're ready. You may need 15 minutes. You may need a day because you are so undone by what happened. But it is always our job to convey the message that there is nothing more important than our connection. And that was difficult. And statements from a caretaker to heal or repair oftentimes take the form of things like, I'm sorry, buddy, I didn't know how to make that go better for us. You know? I'm saying, I'm not taking full blame for it. I'm not saying it's all my fault, but it's clear I didn't know how to have that go better. Simple statements like that can be really, really helpful. Because many of these kids, because of core shame, they are all filled up with respect to responsibility for things that they've done wrong. These kids will deny it. They just can't let any more in. And so when we're able to come to them and share with them the responsibility in some way for what has happened, it makes it more manageable. Compassion and wisdom and the holding on to one's power. I'm not going to go into this much here, but in the book I talk about it a lot. These kids challenge us. They challenge our authority. and we have to hold on to our power, or they don't feel safe. Kids who are in the care of a caretaker who doesn't have the authority or power to be able to make the situation go well, those kids are anxious. Those kids are not going to do well. There are a number of different strategies. Certainly, one of them is you never enter into a power struggle that you can't win. I'll oftentimes have teachers or parents or people say, they'll say how patient I seem. I'm not patient at all, but I hate to lose. Okay? And when a child pulls me off my game so that I am now emotionally dysregulated and looking to somehow win, I've lost. And so in the book, we talk a lot about how it is that you hold on to your power with these kids. I spoke already a little bit about the affective reflective dialogue. Part of what we're trying to do is help these kids develop new narratives. Many of these kids have these just kind of disorganized narratives. They experience themselves as a random collection of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And they spend a lot of time looking in the eyes of caretakers who are kind of reflecting back, yeah, you make no sense. There are no patterns. When we provide a narrative that says, when your mom didn't come on time for the meeting today, it felt awful. And you didn't know what to do with those feelings. It felt so awful. Next thing you knew, you were throwing a chair across the room. All right? It's not saying throwing a chair across the room is a good thing, but it is saying you do make sense. Kids need to have a sense that we believe they make sense, because that's the only way for them to develop coherent narratives. And then we start helping them fill in the pieces about how they make sense. Caretakers delight in the child. These kids don't get that a lot. And it's absolutely essential. When a youngster can make you laugh, or they come into the room and they see you smile with a sense of it's good to see them, it's so important. It's so important. It goes back to that core shame, and the notion that they actually have something to give. Attachment is facilitated by the child's sense that the caretakers want to take care of them. But it is locked in by the child's sense that the child has something to give the caretaker. There's a much stronger sense when kids have a feeling that they get something from the relationship, or that the adult or the caretaker gets something from the relationship as well. And lastly, rhythm. This is kind of an interesting thing that Bruce Perry talks a lot about, and I've seen it be pretty effective. There's some others that we haven't put up here, but rhythm, just the awareness that rhythmic interactions between an adult and a child can be very, very helpful. Tossing a ball back and forth, doing rhythmic hand games. There's something about the predictability of rhythm. There's something about the way in which the central nervous system responds to rhythm that makes kids more accessible to connection. And when you're able to be engaged in rhythm together with a child, it can be a very nice attachment kind of supportive endeavor. All right. So let's take a minute and think about what are the variables impacting the creation of attachment-informed milieu. If we want staff to have a sense that the things that I'm talking about are important, and we want them to have the capacity to bring those to the work, to bring them to their interactions with kids, well, then we need to figure out, how do we do that? How do we facilitate that? It doesn't just happen. You're going to have some people in any treatment milieu who are kind of gifted in this arena. And you're going to know it. And you're going to have some people who move to a relational stance of instruction or authority and have limited capacity. Now, maybe they can be taught, but first, we've got to get the right people in there. So staff selection is one of the critical variables in terms of creating milieus that are attachment informed. And I've got 4 real quick metrics for that. One is the relational style within the mid-range of the relational continuum. In attachment, we talk about people being relationally dismissive and relationally preoccupied. And it's not great to be at either end of that continuum, okay? But where we find the folks who tend to do best in this work, they're not relationally dismissive, but they're not completely relationally preoccupied. The relationally dismissive folks are not going to be able to consistently attend to the attachment dynamics that we're describing. The relationally preoccupied folks are likely to get lost in the child's affect and have a hard time holding on to the structure. So we need people who are kind of in that mid-range, a little bit more to the right here than the left. One of the things that we understand, too, is that if you're going to work effectively with kids, you need to have a coherent understanding of your own relational history. And I think Siegel's book, Parenting from the Inside Out, I think it was just a beautiful discussion of this, that if we do not know or understand our relational history, we are much more likely to emulate what was done to us in our interactions with those we care for. If we know it, it could have been painful and very difficult. But if I know that, and I have a very clear narrative that says it shouldn't have been that way, well, then you're good to go. You know, you need some skills, but you're good to go. You don't have to have come from a setting that was what it should have been. If you were, that's great. Many of us weren't. That's not the central variable. The central variable is, do we understand where we came from? Do we understand how it impacted us? And do we know whether it should have been that way? Next is positive or secure self-esteem. These kids eat your lunch. You know, they challenge you. And if you're a tad bit narcissistically vulnerable, and you in some way need them to affirm your power, your authority, you're in deep trouble. And so are they. These kids are going to hammer at that. So you need adults who have fundamentally secure sense of self. And lastly, we need adults who are affectively available. If you put somebody in one of these settings with somebody who's affectively flat, it just confuses kids. They don't know how to respond to it. They project all kinds of stuff onto them. So when you're looking for staff, you know, this is what you're looking for. You know, I've hired a lot of people to do this work, and it isn't always easy to find these attributes. I'm not saying it is easy. And sometimes you go, all right, this is as good as it gets. This is the approximation. But I think it is important that we know what we're looking for. All right, 3 other variables are staff training. You've got to train staff in this, and it has to be ongoing. If you are not providing staff an understanding of why this is essential to their healing, to the kids' healing, then they're going to oftentimes resort to which domain? Structure. And unfortunately, structure won't take you all the way to the end of the race. It'll make it safer. It's better than not having structure. But you've got to train folks in valuing this, and then how do you do it? And it is possible. Once again, you're going to have some folks who are better at it than others. An institutional culture of relational connection and kindness from the top down. We are rarely able to treat the kids in these programs better than we treat one another. And that's hard. We work in such a pressure cooker. The amount of paperwork, the amount of regulations. It is not easy to keep your heart and soul when you're being stampeded by obligation. So I don't hold that up there. You know, I've run programs. I know how hard that is. I know that there are times when it gets really complicated, and we have a hard time creating a culture that essentially conveys our belief in connection. Staff retention, if you're going to create a culture that's fundamentally a healing, attachment-informed culture, you've got to keep people around. The good news is, from my experience, and I'm trying to do some research on this, but from my experience, attachment-informed milieus are phenomenally helpful at staff retention. People feel connected to each other. There's a sense that they're growing as they learn the model, as they work within it. It doesn't mean that retention will ever be perfect, but I think that it's something that can be thought of as actually very, very helpful in that regard. All right. So what have I said? Essentially, kids served within our intensive treatment milieus, more often than not, come to us with broken hearts, expressed in problematic neurobiology, confusion, sadness, hopelessness, anger, fear, and all kinds of other things. And as sappy as this may sound, the healing of a broken heart can only be accomplished through connection, wisdom, and compassion. And maybe sometimes a bit of a psychopharmacological intervention. I'm not resistant to that. It's something that can be helpful sometimes. So, Paul Russell, and I looked for this quote. He was a psychoanalytic guy, really more of a self-psychological guy in Boston, big name for a long time. Many of you probably know him. And I wasn't at this presentation, but Paul was dying. I have a friend who was there. Paul was dying, and he had one last presentation to the Massachusetts Psychoanalytic Association. You know, not a freewheeling group, probably. And Paul made the statement that the only thing he had ever believed actually healed anyone with whom he had worked was that he loved them. And supposedly people got up and walked out of the hall. But I think there's some truth to that. I mean, it's a word that we don't use a lot. But I do think that when working with these kids, it is only that gets you to come back the next day sometimes, because these guys are hard. They're tough. This is not easy work. So that concludes the things that I planned to say today, and I'm now open to any questions or observations or thoughts. Yeah.
I was just about to ask you about what you said at the beginning, which was that you are hesitant to use the word love, that it's not something that we talk about in people say. Given that you just described love,
yeah.
Like why is it that you're hesitant, or why are we hesitant to talk in those terms?
I'm hesitant because I don't want to be dismissed as kind of soft-minded. You know, we have a lot of, we're in the era of evidence-based work. Things like love are a little hard to measure. So I'm a little reluctant because I want to maintain my credibility. However, I am completely comfortable, if you're comfortable with, saying at the essence of what we're talking about is loving these kids with wisdom, knowledge of what it is that they need, and just a deep commitment to providing that. So I think it's a great question. I hope that as a field, actually, Hughes, in one edition of one of his earlier books, Pace was place. It had love in it. And he caught so much hell for it that he took it out in the next book. So it's hard when people take a stand against love. It's a good question. Other thoughts? Questions? Yeah.
If you're starting to work with a kid, how do you titrate as you go along? How much touching, hugging, holding is okay or not okay?
Yeah, great question, Jim. These kids come into us oftentimes very, very wary. And if my need for this child to accept my love undermines my ability to be empathically attuned to what he can tolerate from me, how much intimacy can the child tolerate? You're always looking for that. You're always looking for really a sense of how far in can they tolerate me going. When you get these kids talking about emotional issues, I'll oftentimes talk to the folks that I'm training and say, when you get a kid like this, or maybe anybody, when you get them when you get them touching emotional content, do not hold them on the emotional ropes. Help them pull back from it. So they begin to talk about something very painful. Monitor their capacity to tolerate that and to associate you with it. And then when you need to, when it seems appropriate, pull back. And humor or distraction, there are all kinds of ways to step back from it. So I think that it's an essential point, because I think if we go in and we say, I'm going to love you and you're going to love being loved by me, without a lot of careful attunement to the fact that this youngster finds me terrifying, it's not going to work. So it's very much kind of reading the cues and trying to move in. In my use of the stuffed wolf, I have to read whether or not the youngster is going to be able to tolerate the intimacy of that playfulness. Because sometimes they'll block it. Sometimes they'll look at me like I'm insane. Sometimes they'll look at me like I'm insane, and then they'll laugh. And we'll laugh together, and it goes well. But other times they look at me like I'm insane, and they go out, and I'm never going back to that guy. He treated me like a baby. And so sometimes you read it well, and sometimes you don't. But you're always trying to figure out, where is that place? How deep can I go? Because I want this kid to feel touch. Physical touch is also, you cannot work with these kids without physical touch from my perspective. Now, once again, you got to be careful. You don't want to be intrusive in a way that they can't manage it. You've got all those things. But one of the things that when I was in the position of hiring folks to do this frontline work, if somebody said, I don't want to be in a room alone with a child, we wouldn't hire them. You've got to be willing to take some risk. You've got to be willing to be with a child in the way that they need you to be with them. If you have such apprehension about sexual allegations or inappropriate touch, then you probably should be working with a different population. It doesn't mean there isn't a place for you, but it's probably not with this population of kids. But by the same token, if every youngster you see, you need to grab them, and particularly with the ASD kids, you're going to be having kids pull back from you in a pretty aggressive way. Good question. Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Stewart. I'm one of the medical students.
Yeah.
The PACE model, I think, is really going to stick with me. What you said was you can be tolerant of all thoughts, but not all behaviors in these kids. Yeah. And so my question is, for a kid who's very behaviorally dysregulated, do they just require more patience? Or do you need to
No, I think when we talk about how do you hold on to your power, that's really what we're talking about. I had a little girl in my office. She was adopted from Eastern European orphanage. I've worked with her for a number of years. Periodically, she just comes unglued. And she was going to destroy a painting in my office yesterday. And in that moment, I have to be powerful. I have to go and take her hands and say, I will not let you destroy my property. I will not let you kick me. I will not. And then as soon as she stops, right back into being playful and engaged with her. And then at a later point, needing to make a little bit of a repair on that, saying, that happened between us the other day, last time you were in, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry that was hard. I know it was hard. So it's setting the limit as clearly as you need to set. They need to know you're in charge, or they're not safe. Maybe nobody else is either. Other questions or thoughts? I know we've hit the hour. I appreciate you all being here. You're a great group to work with. Thank you. Yeah.